All right, so for today's lesson, we're going to talk about tests, but even broader than that, testing. And the current word involved or assigned to this idea is assessment. So when you hear the idea assessment or this assessment and evaluation, you should think of tests, but I'd like to just kind of figure out what else you think of, anything that's involved with that. And we'll talk about those and then fill in any gaps. Okay, so when we think about assessment, we think of tests. What are other ways that you as a teacher can assess or evaluate, or you as a student have been assessed or evaluated in school? Brenda?
Questions or research papers.
Okay, when you say questions, what do you mean by that?
Like the teacher will ask you a question to see if you understood.
Oh, just in like what I just did to you?
Right.
Okay, all right. Well, you put that along with research papers and that. So, but right, both of those are assessment, evaluation things. What were you going to think of?
Progress reports. Just how
Okay.
assess how you've been doing over a certain period of time.
All right, so a progress report, that is not really an assessment or an evaluation. That's just a reflection of the different assessments and evaluations that have been made. You see that it's related to the subject. It is related, but it's not an assessment or evaluation. Now your parents might look at that and evaluate from that what you've been doing or so, but not specifically. It is definitely connected. Do you have any ideas, Tamar? Quizzes, yes. So I said tests. Brenda said reports, right? A research paper report, quizzes. What are other things related to quizzes, tests, and research papers that are ways to homework? Yep. Anything else you can think of?
Maybe like even an oral report.
Yep, an oral report. So research paper and report are slightly different, aren't they? You might do something and give a report about it. Read a book, give a report. Do an experiment, give a report. And a research paper is more like study other things and bring it together into a paper. All right, so reports, research papers, quiz, homework, tests. Can you think of anything else?
A pop quiz.
Pop quiz.
When you do review questions, like if you're reviewing materials for a test, you can see how much they have actually gotten down before they take the test.
Okay, so that's just like a question time. All right. There would be other things. I'm trying to think of myself. Well, let's go inside of those things. Mostly we go inside of a quiz or a test. What are the ways that teachers can quiz or test? What are the things they can use in a quiz or test? Explain.
Short answer.
Short answer. Sometimes you get short answer and explain, right? So a short answer is a type of question used on a test. What else is there? An essay question. An essay might be just an assignment all by itself, or it might be a particular question. What other type of items are on a quiz or a test? Definitions. So definition would be kind of like a short answer. It's a specific type of short answer. True or false. Yep, true or false. You ever get a true or false and explain?
Compare and contrast.
Compare and contrast. That's going to be a specific type of a list, right? Okay. Multiple choice. Yeah. Matching. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. How Well, let's just go ahead and start in. We've kind of got our mind thinking about this. There's other aspects of this that we'll get to as we go along. So, first, if we're I'm going to use the word test in a generic sense for a while. I might not always use it, but in a generic sense, we'll use the word test. There are basically there are three types of tests. There's other types, but there's three types of tests, three words that we can use to compare similar types of tests. First is a diagnostic type test. Some people call these formative, some call them diagnostic. Okay, leave a space. And then the second is a formative test. Okay, so some people, when they're talking about tests, would only say there's formative and summative. Some would say diagnostic, formative, and summative. Okay, so the third one is a summative, or I don't know how you say that word. Summative, S-U-M-M-A-T-I-V-E. All right, so let's think about those words. A summative test is going to be what kind of a test? It's going to be a test that summarizes. So it's going to be something like a final exam or something that's at the end of a period of learning. It summarizes and hopefully tells what someone has learned. Okay. A formative test is going to be before that, and it forms in some way. Mostly, a formative test is going to form what a teacher it's going to help the teacher find out what students have learned and what they need to learn. It would also help students know what the teacher thinks is important and how well they know it and how much they should study. I think in our environment, most of the time we would think of formative testing as quizzes. If you don't do so well on a quiz, it's not that bad, and you also know, oh, I need to study that so that way I'll do better on the summative test. So quizzes, most of the time, are formative in nature. Tests, some tests are formative. Many tests in the vocabulary we are used to using are formative. Okay, then the one that I said first is diagnostic. When I say diagnostic test, what occurs to your mind? I'm going to give you a diagnostic test.
To see what you do know before you teach a subject?
To see what you do know before you teach a subject. Yes. So your school might give a diagnostic test to people who are coming into school to see where they are. Where are they going to fit into our curriculum? A teacher you could give a diagnostic test in the middle of the year. You're going to begin a new unit. You give a test. Say, what do my students know? It's good to know what they know. Right? That way you can build off of what they know and give them work from there to give them stuff they need to learn. So diagnostic test is normally, it's not reflected in a grade or a final grade in any way. It's just helping you as the teacher or even the students to know what's coming, what I know, where do I stand, where are we going, type of thing with a diagnostic test. So, those are three words, three adjectives that describe tests. And we use them in different ways and at different times. Now I'm going to give you two other ways to describe tests. And one is, and both of these could apply to all three of those descriptions, some more so than others. So one is called what we would call a teacher-made test. And it's obvious what that description means. It's made by the teacher. So we would think immediately of formative testing as being teacher-made. But it doesn't have to be teacher-made. If I have a math class and I have a math textbook, I probably, as a teacher, would get a resource full of quizzes and tests. Those tests are not, and I've used them, then I'm not making the test, somebody else is making the test. In a sense, those would fall under a teacher-made test category, though, since the other thing to compare teacher-made tests is a standardized test. So a standardized test, so teacher-made test is local. It's in this classroom. A standardized test is normally national or very broad. You all had to take a standardized test of some sort and submit the scores to come to school here. What did you take?
The ACT.
ACT? Everybody in here took, that's what I took also. So ACT. But that's a standardized test. Everybody in the country sits down and takes that test under the same conditions, the same questions or the same bank of questions and that type of thing. So big variety a big contrast with a teacher-made test. So do you understand, with that being the other, why I would say a published test, a publisher-made test in a workbook falls under more like a teacher-made test? Because it's actually a test that's given to the teacher to use how they would want to. They may use it completely, they may use some questions, not all of them, or something like that. So we have standardized tests and teacher-made tests. Why would we use both of those kind of tests? Or what would be the purpose of using one test or the other?
You can use the standardized test to see how your school is doing compared to other schools.
Right. You would want to, if you would use that if you wanted to see how you fit in with other schools, okay, or even, the nation. A teacher-made test is going to benefit, so a standardized test, it will benefit the teacher, but kind of indirectly. A principal is really going to be interested in the standardized test. You can say, how are our 10th graders doing? They might even, some principals spend a lot of time on that. They track year by year, so they track the first grade through, this class has always been lower, so it's not, so just because, last year's 10th graders got this and this year's 10th graders got this, does that mean the teacher's doing worse? Or were last year's 9th graders, is this class generally a little behind? Not that we don't want them to improve, but if this class has always been a little behind, then it's not like, what did you change in your classroom that this year your students are not doing as well? So principals track this a lot of different ways. They do track, Miss 10th grade teacher, how she does over time, but to be fair, they would track how the class does also and the intersection of all that. But that's from a principal, and then he's going to take that information and work with his teachers. Okay, it seems like our science scores have been dropping. Why do you think that is? Or our English scores have been dropping. Whatever, and so they'll work with the teachers. A teacher-made test or a publisher-made test is going to benefit the teacher first. So, all right, now we get into, well, let's do one more thing. With standardized tests, there are two types of standardized tests. One is called a criterion reference test, and the other is called a norm referenced test. So it's either referenced to a criteria or it's referenced to a norm, N-O-R-M. So the word norm is at the beginning, or is related directly to the word normal. Okay? So if a test is referenced to what is normal, then the people that make the test are testing large groups of people to find out what is normal. Does that make sense? Okay. What people that study education and scores and all that have found out is that if you give a reliable, valid test to hundreds and hundreds of people, their scores are going to, the number of scores, let's say you have, the number of scores are going to fit on a curve that looks like this. Okay, it's called a bell curve. And so what they just say is that the most, they get all their scores in, and the most scores are right in the middle. The most people with a particular score is right in the middle. That's just the way it works. That's just the way human nature works. Okay, so if, let's just say for sake of example, that we give this test and the most students got 80 questions correct. So that's going to be right here. And then the way human nature works, you're going to have typically, I mean, if you test enough people, if you test 30 people, it's not going to fit here. But you're talking about testing 3,000 people or thousands and thousands of people. It's going to fall into this curve, and so half the most will be here, and half will be above that, and half will be below that. Okay, this is called a normal curve. It's also called a bell curve because it's kind of like a bell. But it's a normal curve, and so then if you're using a norm reference test, the people that build the test look at this, and then they say, well, normal now, 20 years later, normal is different, and so they re-norm the test. So the scores and what is normal changes because the population changes. What is normal changes. So you'll hear people say, oh yeah, this test, they dumbed that down. Well, if it's a norm reference test, it might be dumbed down, but it wasn't the publisher that dumbed it down. It was the normal person. The normal person got dumber, so the test, in order to reflect what is normal, has to get dumber, if we want to use that scientific term, dumber. Okay, so do you understand a little bit of that? Okay, so if you're having a norm reference test, you are comparing your students to the normal student at whatever age, whether it's a college test or a high school test or an elementary, it's a norm reference test. So, what is a criterion reference test? Well, okay, so I explained the hard one actually. Criteria, this is the easy question. If a norm reference test is comparing your students to what is normal, a criterion reference test is comparing your students to a criteria. And would a criteria change? No, I mean, so a criterion reference test is going to say, do your students know what 2 plus 2 is? Okay, and it's going to be yes or no. A norm reference test is going to say 97% of students know that 2 plus 2 is 4. Do your students fit in with 97% or not, and to what extent do they not? Of course, with one question, you can't norm one question. But so there's a difference there. That's the difference. A criterion reference test, the scoring of it, the way it's scored, the way the score is reported, is telling you, is related to something else. Not whether you got the question right or wrong, but the report, the test report is reported a certain way. So you get an ACT score of 29, that's going to be in a certain percentile of the country. And it's going to have the score, and then it's going to say 89. That means 11% of the country was better than you, 88% of the country was worse than you. Or percentile. Doesn't mean that you got an 89% on the test. It's how you fit in with everyone else. If you're in the 50 percentile, you are smack dab average, which we're used to thinking of 50% is really bad. But 50 percentile is not necessarily. That just means you're right there in the middle. You're the same as the average person that took the test or whatever. Okay, so that's that. Now, I want to talk about three things to think about a test. If a test is a good test. Have you ever taken a test and thought, I wasn't expecting those kind of questions? Okay. I didn't think those were the things that were important. Okay. So these terms are kind of related to this. So there's three terms here. We're going to say validity, reliability, and authenticity. And you would want, if you're a teacher, you want your test to be reliable, valid, and authentic. So validity, is a test valid? If a test is valid, it is testing, it is measuring what it says it will measure. Okay? If I have a test over fractions, and it asks a bunch of stuff that's not related to fractions. It does ask about fractions, but then it asks about other stuff that's not related to fractions. The test might not be very valid because somebody might get the stuff that's not related to fractions wrong and get everything that is related to fractions right and still get a 60% on the test. And I think, oh, they don't know their fractions. Well, but they do know their fractions. It's not a valid test. It might be testing what you want, but it's not testing knowledge of fractions. It's not a valid test for testing fractions. Hopefully that makes sense. So validity says, does the test measure what it says it's measuring? If it's a Unit 3 test and 2/3 of the test is from Units 1 and 2, and Units 1 and 2 aren't necessarily important to knowing what Unit 3 is about, it's not a valid test. You should call it a Unit 1 through 3 test. So validity. Reliability refers to how consistent the test is. So if you, let's say you had 20 things you wanted to find out about your students, 20 different things, and you wrote 3 questions or problems or whatever for each of those 20 things. Okay? And then you put that, 60 items in a bank, and then you said, randomly, give me one of the 3 for each 20 and put them on a test. Give the test. And then, all right, now give me a different one of those 3 and make a different test. Okay? And then take the last one of each 3, and you have 3 different tests that supposedly measure the same thing. Okay? So, if you did that, and your students, and it's a summative test, your students already know everything, they should be able to study the same way. It's very hard with human nature to test this, but you, like Brenda, should be able to take one test or the other test or the third test and get basically the same grade regardless of which test she takes because they're consistent. If they're not, if one test was easy and the other was hard, then it's not a reliable test. So reliability refers to the consistency of actually of getting the same measurement, the same score or the same rank from the test, from audience to audience. You know, I don't have to get a 93 from every student, but a 93 student this year should get a 93, and a 93 student next year should also get a 93. It delivers consistent results. Then the third thing is authenticity. Is it authentic? Now this is more of a judgment. The reliability and validity are more technical, academic aspects of it. You've taught one thing. Did you frame that question in a way that tests what they know or not? Okay. But authenticity refers to, does it test the things that need to be taught, that need to be tested? And this is where you come into a test and you walk out and say, I didn't expect any of that stuff. Okay. Now it might be that you studied the wrong thing. Well, obviously you studied the wrong things, but it might be that you studied the things that the teacher emphasized that you thought was the important stuff, but the test didn't reflect what was important. The test reflected other stuff. So you studied what was important, but the test was not authentic. And it's very easy to make unauthentic, if that's a word, tests. Because sometimes the information we want to emphasize is hard to ask questions about, and the information that's easy to ask questions about is not so important. So we spend our time talking about what's important, and then we ask questions about stuff that we didn't spend time talking about because it's an easier question to ask. That would be one of the reasons one of the ways you could come up with a test that doesn't measure what is important or what is relevant. So it's not an authentic. Do you understand the use of the word authentic with that? It's not authentic. Sure, it covered stuff that was in the class, but it's not really what we were learning. It's just supplementary or tangential. So, all right, so those are all different words related to the idea of tests. Then I would like to mention a certain form of scoring. I think that's the right way to say it. Of recording whether somebody did well or not. And that is called a rubric. Are you familiar with the word or the idea of a rubric? R-U-B-R-I-C. A rubric.
I think a Rubik's Cube.
Rubik's Cube, okay. I think that was just named after the person, so I don't think it has anything to do with rubric. Rubric. All right. So if you write a paper here, and it's a research paper, you should have at least once or twice gotten something back with your paper that's a rubric. It says mechanics, and it lists several levels of whether it is acceptable to unacceptable, and form, and grammar, and research, and presentation, and style, and whatever. So that I created that rubric for our school, but a teacher can create a rubric for anything. You could create a rubric for giving a speech. So rubrics are most helpful with the most highly subjective items that need to be graded. Let me explain that. If I ask a question that's like the old 2 + 2 equals, there's no subjectivity to whether they got the answer right. Okay? It's 2. It's 4. Too many 2's there. It's 4, right? But if I say, tell me what you did this summer, I could say, well, as long as they tell me the truth, they got it right. But that's not what I'm asking for. The question is not really, tell me what you did this summer. The project is, tell me in a delightful way, in an expressive way, what you did this summer. And so then I have to grade, well, how expressive were they? How enjoyable was it to read? Did they use did their writing get in the way of communicating to me by using improper grammar or whatever, those types of things. And that's a little more subjective. It's like, well, this student did this, and I don't even think that's fun, so they get a bad grade. And this person, they worked in my garden all summer, and so they get a good grade, regardless of how they wrote it. They helped me out. That's an exaggeration, but if you have a subjective submission, something that's submitted and it's subjective, then it's a very excellent practice to build a rubric, and that helps you say how, helps you grade. It takes some subjectivity out of a subject. It puts some objectivity into a subjective grading situation. Did you ever compete with your instrument?
Yeah, from Hardy. Yeah.
For Empowered Youth? Did you compete for anything?
Speech.
Speech? Okay. Have you ever competed in arts or anything like that? Okay. So I just thought of this while I was standing here, and it takes a lot of work to make a good rubric. But I thought those things always have like categories. You have the top category, and then there's a few points under there, and then there's another category and a few points. Well, they're very hard to score those, and so you as a judge, because it's very subjective. I can kind of say, well, I know this one was the best, and these two were close to each other, but how do you give them a number, a score that reflects that? If this one was the best, should they get a 100%? What about next year? The person is twice as good as the person that was the best. What do you give them? Okay, so we don't normally worry about next year, but at the same time, that's subjective. It would be much more helpful for our judges if we created a rubric, because it would put object. If we said, appearance, and I said, if they have this, it's top level. That's 5 points for appearance. And if they're here, that's only 1 point for appearance. They appeared and they're there. And then we describe, if the guy has a suit, okay, the guy has a sport coat. Well, a suit is, for a competition, a suit is better than a sport coat. It's more presentable. So you could make different things there, and then, okay, articulation. I'm thinking of music. All of that. If we said, this is what is excellent, and this is what is average, and this is poor, and this is just plain unacceptable, then a judge sits there and says, oh, okay, so for that, they're there, and they're there. Boom. It has taken, and then you leave just a small category for their own impression, and it takes and makes something that's very hard to be fair and accurate, reliable, valid, authentic. It allows you to put that type of stuff in it. But they are very hard to make. You don't just throw them together. So, a rubric. Does that make sense what a rubric is? You should all have one in your handbook or something like that, the one for writing papers and stuff. All right. What are some other things I would like to... Okay, so we talked about items on quizzes and tests. We talked about essays. We mentioned essays. We didn't talk about them. Let me just point out that an essay question, in order for it to be an essay question, it cannot be a question that the students have seen already. Now, a lot of schools and even teachers think, well, it's unfair to ask them a question they don't know the answer to. But an essay is seeking to see their thinking process. If you have given the question beforehand and talked through how to answer it, then they're just writing a long memory. It's a long answer question, not an essay question. So for me, if I'm going to ask a memory question, my opinion, this is my opinion, but it's grown over time. If I'm going to ask a memory question, I might as well ask it in a way that's easy to grade. And an essay is not easy to grade. No use having the student write forever and me read forever to just tell me information that I can ask objective questions about. So essays are important, especially if we want to see higher order thinking, critical thinking skills. You need essays, but no use having kids write out, or students write out their knowledge level skills in an essay. So matching. I don't know that, so did you have fundamentals of education with me last semester? No? Okay. You guys have. So I have one, maybe two, but I have a classic matching question there on the test, the last test, where it has the home and the school and government and church. Okay, so we've spent the time talking about what the home's response, and I give 2 words that relate to home, 2 words. Okay, so in that, and I use a matching thing. I have the 3 that we've talked about, and I have the 6 that match up with them on the other side, the prompt and the response, or whatever the technical words are. Now, but since it's college, we make it a little more complicated. Okay, so a matching question, like actually in your view, it would be that have the 3 over here and the 6 over here, and that's all they have. That's going to be very simple, very, very basic knowledge. It's just knowledge, right? It's not. But if you say, okay, I'm going to put some over here that are not used, and I'm going to put a generic one over here that describes something over here as not. So remember, I have. So the 3 we talked about was. Home, church, school, and then I put the government there. Well, we've been talking about the government all year long, and then we put not applicable. So we have one that's not true but easily confused, and we have a way. And then since we're going to have things over here that we didn't talk about, we want them to be able to give the right answer, not force them into the wrong answer. And then over here you have 6 things. Well, I add 4. A few that sound good, and they have to sound good. They have to be this. If you're going to use matching and you're going to put, they're called distractors, and the same principle applies to multiple choice. Multiple choice and matching are similar in a certain way. There has to be something that's, if you're going to make it more complicated, which is just fine once you get, I don't know, I would say at least out of 7th or 8th grade, or maybe you say once you get into 11th or 12th grade, you make it more complicated. If you want them to be able to discern between something, then you put distractors in there. But the distractors have to be distractors. I had a multiple choice question on a Life of Christ test in college. The answer was Antiochus Epiphanes the 4th. Okay. The other choices were people like Hitler, people not even anywhere, hundreds and even thousands of years away in historical chronology. They were not even close, like Aristotle. I mean, he's old, but Antiochus Epiphanes IV is the guy that set up the idol on the temple grounds and sacrificed a pig, in Jerusalem. Well, it's very, clear. It's like, who did that? Well, it wasn't Aristotle, and it wasn't Hitler. So that's really, to me, that's a real dumb question. It's just like a guy that didn't even work at. He put the right answer there, and he didn't work at it. Just like didn't even try to. You don't want to trick your kids into answering wrong, but you do want to know whether they know the right answer or not. And in order for them to pick the right answer out, they have to have things there to pick between. There was no choice there. It was obvious. You might as well have given them the answer. So, multiple choice and matching are important that way. That the distractor, whatever I call it, the distractor, has to be a plausible answer. True, false questions. Did we mention those? Yeah, we mentioned those. Now, true, false questions. There's not a single true, false, well-written true, false question that is completely true or completely false. If they were, it would be plain. It would be obvious. There's something is said in there that causes you to question yourself. Now, I don't know if I even count off for it, but I have a question. I still use it just because it's fun. But in Deuteronomy chapter 6,
Oh, that question.
yeah, that question. Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 through 9 talks about the parents' responsibilities for rearing the children and the household and everything. And so I put the true-false question says Deuteronomy 4, 6 through 9, blah, blah, blah. It's all the same numbers. It's just a little bit different. It's just a tiny little bit that's not true. It's just, yeah, the chapter and the first verse. It's 6, 4 through 9, and I say 4, 6 through 9. It has to be a true-false question has to be a little tricky. There has to be something in the question that you say, how much, if it's this way, then it's that. If it's that way, then it's this. Now, it needs to be mostly true or mostly false. Otherwise, it's not really very a fair question. Okay? Or, I've had questions that I've taken both true and false, as long as the explanation justified the choice. Okay? Because you could interpret the statement two different ways. If you interpret it correctly, if you said true and you interpret it correctly for true, then it's right. If you said false and interpret it correctly, then it's right. If you said true and interpret it correctly for false, then you got it wrong. So those things are more, to me, I think that's what's necessary at 11th, 12th college level. But the explanation, the increasing vagueness in a true-false question. And if you're really testing, it is called a test, right? If you're really testing, there has to be something challenging about the question. Now, if a person has studied hard, it might not be challenging to them, but to a person that didn't study and just listened and maybe didn't listen very well, it needs to be challenging. It needs to reflect that they don't know it that well. All right. Let's talk about grade systems or a marking system. What kind of grade do you get or give on a test? And we're using tests, but on a research paper, on this or that, and why or when is one more useful or more desired than another? Can you think of the types of grades that marking systems you would get? A, B, C, D, F, yeah. What else might there be? Percentage. And there's others that are less common in our experience. Can you think of one?
I know Mr. Kelso, he puts the amount wrong.
He does a point system for the whole semester. What's that?
He does the correct, how many you
Who?
got correct. Mr. Mitchell.
Okay.
Speech.
Okay.
How many got correct out of.
And then does that turn into a percentage? Or is that just like one speech is 35 points and the next speech is 65 points and the total along the way is, so that's a point system. Right. There are pass-fail systems. You did enough to pass. And there's others beside that. I'll just give my opinion, and I can defend it, but my opinion is that percentage marking systems are most useful with objective information. And letter grade systems are most useful with subjective information. Okay? So a percentage system, and then point systems are related to percentages. Let's just think about this. A percentage, I say, is good with objective material. Because you're just going to say, okay, there's 25 problems. They're all objective problems. You either got it right or you didn't. It doesn't matter how nicely you wrote, or if you used proper, it's not related to proper grammar or expression or anything. Like, it's just you circled the right word, you performed the right calculation, or whatever. There's 25 problems. You missed one, you got what? 4 points off out of 100, and so on. It's objective, and percentages are good for that. A percentage would have a problem. It might not reflect what a student knows very well. When might it not show what a student knows very well? Even with objective problems. Can you think any time when you thought, I knew most of that stuff, but you still got a bad grade?
Like in math, when you do the steps, you fulfill the steps, but you miscalculate something?
That possibly, but there's some subjectivity involved there. Okay, so you'll understand this when I say it. What if there's only 5 questions on the quiz?
Oh, because if you miss one, you automatically fail.
You miss one, you got an 80. You miss 2, and you got a 60. You get in. That's odd. When I was growing up, we'd have a 10-point quiz. You missed 3 on a 10-point quiz, you got a 70. And it might not be. Now, if there was a small amount of things to learn, then you should have learned all of them. But if there's a lot of things to learn and you only have a 10-point quiz, you might know 95% of the information, but you just happen to be asked the 5% that you don't know. And then so that is where a point system kind of counterbalances that. So if I have, I hope I'm illustrating this right, but let's say I use points rather than percentages. I have 10 quizzes and they're all 10-point quizzes. Well, if you miss 3 on one, you get, it probably doesn't, because I don't think the explanation works when all the quizzes are identical. But a point system can help even out what would that be? Reliable or valid? Maybe invalid scores. They don't actually represent what the student knows. A point system can. That's for your info. So letter grades, and then letter grades are good for subjective material because letter grades, at least in our school, by definition, C is average. D is passing, like just good enough. F is failing. B is good. A is excellent. So I read something subjective, even if I have a rubric, I put it in the rubric and then I think, okay, well, my overall impression is that this was good. It was average. Well, then if my overall impression is that's average and I look at the rubric, it should match up. Okay, maybe the rubric should inform me of what I think is average and what's not. Or maybe I'm saying, well, I made this rubric too easy or too hard or something like that. But the letter grades, in my mind, subjective things should be given letter grades without a number in mind. Now, in order to average, you have to put a number with that letter grade. But you assign the grade using letters. And then you say, well, this many numbers is an A. So somewhere inside that is what this was. Or somewhere inside this range of numbers is the kind of B that they got. That way you can average your objective scores with your subjective scores. All right. Did we talk about everything I wanted to? Formative and summative, yes. Teacher-made, standard-made. Validity, reliability, authenticity. Criterion referenced, norm referenced. Ways to record grade information. And that would be A Yes. And rubrics, we talked about rubrics, and types of test questions. Yep. Okay. So there's a bunch of information about testing and tests. Anything come to mind that you think, oh, I always wondered, or that makes sense, or why this that I experienced doesn't fit with what you said?
I have a question with essays. So if like a teacher gives you an essay, would you say it'd be better to do more of a, like you said, you don't want the knowledge back at you in a sense. So with history, detailing a war, would that be?
Well, so, are you a history major?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So am I criticizing Mr. Reinhardt by giving this answer?
No.
Well,
Essay in general.
no, I understand. So if you just want the details of a war, what are you asking for?
Always, in a sense, kind
Or information of some sort.
of. Right.
Okay. So that's not, no reason to put that in an essay.
Okay.
But if you want to say, explain why this happened, well, then you're wanting them to connect, this happened in Austria, and this happened here, and this happened, and the relationship there caused this to happen. If you're asking for cause and effect, some type of draw a conclusion, those types of things, then you would want an essay question. The difficulty with those, though, is the tendency to give the full explanation and all of that in class before you ask them the question. In order for it to be a question that really tests their thinking skills, it has to be not something totally unknown to them, but not a situation that you explained everything for. So you give them facts and information, and the seeds are there for them to make the connections, and then you ask them to make the connections. Then you know that they know how to make connections. But if you just told them what the connections are and asked them to tell you what the connections are, then you know that they can remember what you told them the connections were. So essay questions to be written out, essay questions are very hard. Now, one of the things that's just almost all problems are essay questions. And problems are such that you can create different problems that measure the same thing over and over again. But you can't always, it's a little harder in history to find a certain set of circumstances and another set of circumstances that were similar and explain how it worked here and then show them these circumstances and expect them to, and so we resort to what's easier by telling them what they should know. And to a certain extent, certain things we do need to tell them what they should know. You have to think about what you're trying to accomplish at that age and that grade with that. So history, drawing conclusions from history might be hard. Teaching them in government or economics. So if I teach an economic principle, and then I go to another culture and I explain something, I can expect them to apply that economic principle to another culture if I've explained how it worked in this culture. Different currency, different people, different time, different time, but the principles are true there. That would be, then I can ask an essay question I can just say, in 1953, in Argentina, this, they should be able to notice what I'm saying, what's happening, and say what will happen by economic principle. History is a little harder, I would say. But in your social sciences, economics, and government, those have, to me, stronger principles. More clear concepts and principles to ask them in an essay question to answer. All right.